Oh, so many examples of books. No one can read. Certainly haven't read everything. No one can read everything. But when I think about books on race, I group them into different categories. Much of what I read, because I'm an academic, is secular stuff on race. Because quite frankly, I just think a lot of evangelicals traditionally have just gotten it wrong. So some of the books that are written by non-Christians but yet are helpful on race. One book would be a book by a guy named Benjamin Isaac. It's called The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity. It's about a 500-page book, and he shows how race and racism and racialization existed in the ancient world well before modernity. Because often you have Christians saying things like, race did not exist in the Bible. And I want to refine that and say, no, the category did, but the category was constructed for different reasons in the Bible. Race as a modern social construct didn't exist in the Bible. Race wasn't rooted into biological inferiority and pseudoscientific racism, all that stuff in the Bible, but race as a category existed. And the book by Benjamin Isaac just walks through many ancient texts that show how ancients racialized people. I mean, very overt statements that people made. Another helpful book that's more in a secular realm will be a book written by a Latino scholar named Richard Delgado. Now, this is a book that I don't agree with. Everything in this book I don't agree with. But the things on race I think are helpful. It's called An Introduction to Critical Race Theory. Critical race theory is a far left theory, and I'm not a critical race theorist. I'm a conservative Christian evangelical, but I can learn from anybody. I can learn from a racist, and I can learn from somebody who's not a racist. And the book, Critical Race Theory, is a book that defines categories: privilege, microaggression, colorblindness. It outlines what that is, and it highlights that racism is normal, not an abnormality. It's a normal part of reality. And it also argues how whiteness in this country has always been prioritized over non-whiteness. And I think once you can get sort of those categories in your thinking, you're able then to understand why we have these kinds of conversations in the discussion about race. Another book written by a Christian, but he was a sociologist. This is a very important book, I think, for Christians, evangelicals especially. It's called Divided by Faith, and it's written by Michael Emerson. Michael, I don't know exactly what denomination he is, but he's an evangelical, white evangelical sociologist. And he does good sociological work and shows you how the evangelical movement and racism cannot historically be separated from one another. And he goes through and interviews white Christians and black Christians on race and shows how they come to different conclusions and answers about race relations in the church and in America. It's a very important work, Divided by Faith. And I wrote a book called One New Man, The Cross and Racial Reconciliation of Pauline Theology. And what I'm trying to do in that book is just simply say this is a gospel issue. This is a theological issue. So that book that I wrote, I think it fails in that I don't carefully define categories of race and social constructs and those sorts of things, because there are other folks who've done work on that do that better than I could in that book. But my focus is to generally use the category of Jew and Gentile, and then to make the argument primarily from Paul's writings, but really it's a biblical narrative that I'm tracing, that it's always been part of God's design to reconcile races, and by that I mean different groups of people together, red and yellow, black and white, Jew and Gentile, in Christ, and to show evangelicals this is a gospel issue, because when I wrote the book in 2010, evangelicals weren't having as many discussions about this as a gospel issue as they are now. And so I wanted to say, no, this is a gospel issue, this is theological, this is biblical, so we need to care deeply about this. One New Man, The Cross and Racial Reconciliation, and Pauline Theology. And I have a whole list of other books that I could give you, but I think that's a good place to start.